The planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until you've thoroughly tested every last close-justed view, I find the more you think you know, the less you really do.
That's true, Dr. Zayas. Very well.
Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The Higherside Chat Show, Greg Carlwood and Company.
All right, Higherside Chatters, by now we've seen enough examples to know the world's largest companies do everything they can to undermine international law, the environment, and consumers themselves if it means another dollar for the shareholders. And while obese, ignorant cheerleaders for capitalism wave their American flags, they don't see the damage done behind the thin facade of happy-go-lucky marketing, flashing lights, bright colors, and a few smiling models. We're taught that capitalism is the height of human progress, that it's a system that breeds innovation and efficiency, yet we hear plenty of stories of suppressed technologies and buried patents, including everything from cancer cures to new transportation methods. So the titans of industry can tell us it's a perfect world while they sweep the problems, crimes, and conspiracies under the rug, but the true costs and missed opportunities are too vast to ever really be measured appropriately. Well, today's guest, Cosima Dannoritzer, knows these things all too well. She's a filmmaker and activist who has been focused on highlighting problems with the big machine and has made two amazing documentaries with The Lightbulb Conspiracy, which exposes the practice known as planned obsolescence, and The E-Waste Tragedy, which tackles the throwaway nature of the Western world and the terrible problems it causes all over this island Earth. Both unique subjects I don't see talked about nearly enough, and I can't wait to get into it. All the way from Spain, Cosima, welcome to the Higherside.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for doing this. Your documentary, The Lightbulb Conspiracy, is really one of my favorites out there. It's so unique, and I learned so much that really just blew my mind. Things that I've never heard anyone else really talking about before or since. So to get you here to talk about it, that's a real treat. But before we do get into the content, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a filmmaker on these underexposed topics.
Well, actually, initially thought I would like to work in Hollywood and make big fiction productions or whatever. And then I realized at one stage when I was making coffee in a production company somewhere as a student, but in reality, there's stories out there that you couldn't invent. And suddenly I found myself attracted to documentary. And then recently, also the other thing that's been happening is I think people have been getting a lot more interested in ecology and how the economy works, how all these machines work that keep a whole world going. And in a way, that's kind of a response to that also, you know, to put out information. I think as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, our job really is to provide information and tell stories and put facts on the screen so people can make up their minds and say, well, you know, now I know this, what am I going to do about it? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Should I change this? Is this acceptable? Because a camera is a wonderful thing. A camera can go beyond statistics. You can take people somewhere. You can show them a country, you know, talking about waste, for instance, instead of saying we've produced that many tons of waste. You can actually show where it ends up. You can show a horrible dump site where children are recycling, and that creates a whole other dimension. So yeah, I feel lucky, and I think it's a fascinating profession, and I think it's a very good way of exchanging information and starting debates.
Yeah, well said. Noble goals for sure. And to get into the content of The Lightbulb Conspiracy, for people who don't really know, what is planned obsolescence?
Well, somebody actually in the 50s defined it in a really surprising, revealing sort of way, a designer called Brooke Stevens, who said that planned obsolescence is the desire of a consumer to own something a little sooner than is necessary. And what he actually meant by that is that this particular designer, he was using design to tempt people, but planned obsolescence actually a lot of the time goes even further. It means that, you know, we don't actually want the new version yet, but there's something inside it, something breaks. It could be a chip, it could be a weak piece of plastic or metal or whatever, and something breaks, and then you have to replace it. And this is programmed. It means basically that designers, you know, with all the talents that people have and all the, you know, training they've had, that they actually use their talents to make something on purpose with a limited lifespan. That's planned obsolescence. But planned obsolescence comes in different forms. It comes in, something breaks, nothing you can do about it, especially as an amateur, so you buy a new one. But there's also psychological obsolescence in a way. For instance, fashion is a good example. We have a jumper, it's still fine, it still warms us. It's cold outside, it's perfectly okay. But we quite fancy the new models that just come out. We like the color that's in season this year. So we throw something away that's still perfectly all right. Which means planned obsolescence is not always an evil thing imposed by big evil companies. It's something that we participate in, and a lot of the time we do it quite willingly, but other times we don't do it quite as willingly. It's quite complex, and there's lots of factors at work.
Right, yeah, and this is such an interesting area to me. I mean, shortening the life cycle of products to increase consumer demand. And there are those two ways to do it. There's the marketing aspect, which happens largely in the smartphone arena. Everybody's got to get that new phone every year. And that's just, advertising manipulation. That is the psychological side. But it is the fail by design stuff that is so interesting to me. And it happens in a lot of products that we take for granted, and we assume that the technology is as good as it can be. But in so many cases, you find out that that's just not true. And if we wanted to get a little bit more into the history of the concept of planned obsolescence, where did this idea of building things to break down initially come from?
I think there was a big change around about the 1920s, around about then when mass production took off, when we had big assembly lines that were becoming more efficient and they were churning things out, and, things started getting a little bit cheaper, and a lot more people started buying them. That's not a bad thing in itself. But suddenly all the manufacturers started getting worried. They thought, what if everyone has bought everything and these things last forever? And then suddenly this amazing boom is going to come to an end. And, the factories will stop working. People won't have jobs. We won't make any money. So it's almost like, I see a point now when there were two roads. They could have decided to maybe produce less, but they decided to produce even more and just shorten the lifespans to keep this going. And, that's also the origins of our growth economy that we have today. And, it's a definitely kind of fork in the road, and they went that way. And then from then onwards, this whole concept has just been expanded. So the first example at the time, for instance, was the light bulb. At the time, you could buy light bulbs which lasted 2,000 or 3,000 hours. That's about 2 or 3 years or whatever if you would use them in this day and age. And if you look at the advertising, all the companies were showing off with mine lasts longer than yours kind of thing. It's brighter and it lasts longer. That was kind of the two big arguments. And this suddenly disappears, and all the light bulb manufacturers basically, they got together. They had a meeting in Geneva. Apparently it just happened over Christmas, so nobody knew what was going on. And they decided, let's limit the lifespan of light bulbs and actually reduce the lifespan. And then we can sell that many more units. And if you look at the internal documents from all these companies, you can see all these little calculations that we're doing, how many more bulbs they would be able to sell. And they were doing specific lifespan tests to reduce the lifespan. So, the filament would break more easily. And they had a system whereby all the manufacturers had to send light bulbs to a central office in Geneva every month. And they would screw them into little testing racks and then let them burn and then see how long they lasted. And if they lasted beyond what was set at that time, then there was actually a fine to pay. So if you go again into the archives, you find all these invoices and people saying, okay, well, we have trouble paying this, but we promise we won't do it again, and then there's someone else saying, well, okay, we limited the lifespan of our light bulbs, but now we're selling too many. Now you're getting, worried about the quota. So you see this kind of really highly specialized internal debate going on that wouldn't happen these days anymore, because we also have to remember this is the time when there was no anti-monopoly laws or anything like that. There was no consumer protection. So all these light bulb companies just did this and published, the lifespans that were considered acceptable, and they kept lowering them, and eventually that arrives at 1,000 hours, and around the 40s, that's about a year. And funnily enough, that's still the lifespan we have for incandescent bulbs now. And, that makes you wonder. You think, well, since the 40s, so that's like 70 years, surely they're could have been a better system. But then, of course, they weren't looking for that. Why should they change something that's working for them?
Right. And yeah, I love the example and the part of the documentary where you're talking about the light bulb cartel, that group who formed. And it's so wild to hear that they used to actually test these light bulbs, and they would find companies that were making bulbs that outlasted the 1,000 hour standard. And it's just mind-blowing and just such a micro example of a problem that probably spans to every product on the Western market to some degree. And I don't hear about it anywhere else. It's just very interesting. Apparently they got, there were some patents filed years later for bulbs as high as 100,000 hours. But of course, they never make it to market.
Yes, there was a bulb invented in Berlin in the 80s, and it was supposed to last 150,000 hours. And it actually had quite specific purpose, as they wanted it for traffic lights. The idea being that you would save energy also on sending trucks out at night to replace bulbs, because a lot of the bulbs and traffic lights, now a lot of them are LEDs, but at the time when they were incandescent, they would send out trucks regularly and try and change the bulbs before they would burn out. So, you wouldn't have any accidents. So this bulb would have had a use in a very particular field, even though it used a tiny bit more electricity, but that would have been offset by the fact that you wouldn't have to send these crews out all the time. You put a bulb in and it would probably last forever.
Right.
But yeah, it didn't go into mass production. And, if you look up patterns on the internet, you find a lot of patterns for bulbs. You find a lot of patterns for also devices that you can put in between the bulb and your device and see whether you can be more efficient with the energy. I think people had a lot of ideas, but since the old-fashioned bulb was working really well as a business proposition, no one really went into exploring that. This was working, so why change it?
Right.
And at the time, I think it's ironic also because, the light bulb is like a symbol for bright ideas and, the future and progress and innovation. And then they pick just, that particular object and make it like the first official victim of planned obsolescence. That's kind of tells you a lot about the time we live in, and that's around about also the 20s is the time when you realize that the lifespan starts disappearing from advertising. If you look at modern advertising, very rarely they tell you how long something is going to last. They're much more likely to tell you that you're going to be really cool, you're going to have more girls, or, you're going to have more success with the boys, or you're going to have more friends, or you're going to be happier. They actually don't really go into the technical specifications that much anymore. And during the lifespan, at the beginning of the light bulb cartel, it was actually prohibited to talk about lifespan. That was one of the first things they kind of took off the menu at the time, so people wouldn't actually be able to spot the difference and see how the lifespan was decreasing year after year.
Wow. And that is so interesting, the irony in the light bulb as a symbol of ideas. I like that. And what's amazing, too, is this fire station in Livermore, California, actually has a yearly festival because they have a bulb that's been burning since 1901, and they find it super interesting when really they just have what should have been a standard bulb, and it slipped past the cartel, I guess, over 100 years ago and is still in the socket in the fire station. But it's just so silly when you see this festival and these people that are just paying attention to this bulb, and then the real history. It's kind of goofy.
Well, also, this bulb is interesting because I think it's pre-cartel. So it comes from a time when the market wasn't also quite as centralized yet. Now you have General Electric and you have kind of the big players on the market. You have Philips, you have Osram, you name them. But at the time, electricity was a new thing, so there was lots and lots of new people, a bit like today when everybody goes into startups or they go into some kind of internet business or an app or something. At the time, one of the things you might want to go into is sort of something electricity related and light bulbs and machines, whatever. So this particular bulb came from the company who were proud of their long lifespans. That's what you would do at the time, you would argue with that. The other thing is, though, the bulb is quite dim. It's not as strong as some of the bulbs we have today, so you have to take that into account. If your bulb burns slightly less brightly, then it's not going to die as fast. But still, this bulb is now over a century old. It's had a 100-year birthday party. It's had a 110-year birthday party. It has a little webcam pointed at it, so you can look at it anytime you like from anywhere on the planet. It's always burning. And in the meantime, generations of firemen have come and gone, and, 3 webcams have gone and broken, and the bulb is still there. And so it's for me, it's like it's a symbol. It wouldn't be correct to say we need these old bulbs. They're the only bulbs that really long lasting. I'm sure we could also be more energy efficient and all that, but it's a symbol for the change in attitude that was happening at the time. And you can see that also in a lot of magazines at the time. For instance, there was the marketing people at the time, they were saying things like, a product that doesn't wear out is a tragedy for business and things like that. And they were looking at all these things that people had in their homes, like the silver forks or furniture that had come down to generations, and they were kind of also working hard on discrediting these things, because the idea of having something in your family that's been there for generations, that was a venerated idea. And this also needed to be changed, because they wanted to say to people, well, this is really old, and this is old-fashioned, and you're a modern person. And there's all these articles where they're attacking all these heritage objects in a way, because they wanted people to feel modern and go out and, throw everything out and buy everything new, and then keep replacing it much more regularly than they did before. So all these, traditional objects were seen as a sort of threat to business in a way.
Right. It's also silly because we used to have repairmen, repair shops for things. I mean, even cobblers for shoes. People used to have their shoes fixed so they could wear them longer. And today we throw away basically everything. I mean, I think the TV repair business is basically gone. Appliance repair, it'd be very hard to have that career because we just throw things away now. We just buy the new one.
Yeah, I had an experience when I was traveling in India, and I saw all these little stalls on the streets, which were basically consisting of 2 young people and a tiny table or chair or something, foldy thing that they would bring in the morning and just set it up somewhere. And they'd have maybe 1 screwdriver and a toothbrush and a rag or something. And with that, they would repair anything, mobile phones, pieces of electronics, like cassette recorders, DVD machines or whatever. And it's kind of ironic when you go back to Europe or you go to the US and you take something that's damaged, back to the shop, and they say, oh no, it's impossible to repair that, it can't be done, or it's too expensive, and then you go to the other side of the world, to India, and it's no problem at all. They will try to repair anything. It's also quite interesting how, we're talking about how to fight against planned obsolescence, how some of these skills are coming to Europe now, like in Spain or in France. Now you have a lot more electronics shops run by Indians or Pakistanis or whatever, and they're bringing these skills to Europe. So, for instance, in Barcelona, Barcelona was one of the co-production countries of the film, and you have all these little phone shops, and if you go into the big department stores, they won't repair a mobile phone, but all the little phone places have little signs up saying, we repair phones, we repair your screens. And so in a way, these skills are coming back, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's definitely something to be optimistic about. And so to contrast the mass production planned obsolescence model in the case of the light bulb, how did something like the manufacturing of light bulbs differ in a country like Germany at the time?
Well, there is an interesting story sort of between the East and the West. In the communist bloc countries, for instance, in East Germany, they weren't interested in throwing things away quite as often, because they were, running out of resources all the time, and a lot of them had to be bought from the West, and they didn't have the resources for that. So they were actually a lot more interested in things lasting longer. And also you find, if I talk to any friend from the former East, they have repair skills, they know how to repair simple things at home, and they know how to make things last. It's really amazing. It's a different culture. And what happened in the 80s is actually that in East Germany, they decided to design a longer lasting light bulb and then take it to an international lighting fair. And they thought they were going to have people queuing up saying, that's really amazing. At last, somebody got past those 1,000 hours. Theirs lasted 2,500 hours, and it was made by, the national Nava factory. They produced light bulbs for literally, practically the entire Eastern Bloc. And then nobody wanted to buy this bulb. They kind of got, laughed out of the room practically, and people saying, you're completely mad, this is going to cost jobs, you can't think like that, this is not going to work. And the interesting thing is that when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, this factory closed quite quickly. The products didn't do that well on the Western, on the globalized market. But on the other hand, if you go to the flea market, people are still looking for these bulbs. They have a sort of cult value. And if you've got one, you can screw it in a place that's maybe a little bit more difficult to get to, like a really high ceiling or something. And it's going to last slightly longer. So you can sort of see it's actually a useful thing. And you can see that planned obsolescence, it's actually stealing our time in a way, because it's making us repair things and go out and buy things. And I know a lot of us, we like shopping, but it also depends what it is. Like I personally, for instance, I don't really enjoy replacing things like, printers and electronics that I have at home that I use for my work. But, every time you get a new one, something is going to be incompatible. You need to reinstall everything. You're going to spend time on the customer helpline.
Yep.
You probably need a new ink cartridge, so it's not only about money. I think it's also, it keeps us busy.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And I do love that part of the documentary where you talk about the contrast between the Western way and the Eastern way. And another point about Germany that was interesting, for the reasons you mentioned, their limited resources and stuff like that at the time, they actually made minimums. Like they had refrigerators that had to last 25 years as opposed to a cartel who's saying that no item can last longer than this. They had the complete 180 approach and were trying to force companies, hey, if you're going to make something, you better make it well, and it needs to last at least X amount of years. And that's pretty awesome, really, from the standpoint of the people.
Yeah, and also this actually came down directly from the government, because it was a nationalized industry. So you probably had like one major production facility that produced fridges for the entire country, or maybe even for several Eastern Bloc countries. And it was like the same design. And they knew they didn't have all these materials to squander. So they put the best people on the design job saying it's got to be a minimum of that many years. And people were also looking forward to that because maybe they'd been actually waiting for this fridge for 8 years. Maybe they'd had to bribe somebody for it, or maybe they'd had to share it with somebody. You couldn't just go out and buy as many fridges as you liked, So once you got one, I think nobody saw the point in making it break artificially. Once you finally had it, they were much more focused on the purpose of that particular machine and what good it could do, and why you actually needed it. And I think the problem is over the years in the West, we've got so used to thinking in terms of, this is good for the economy, things break, and yes, there's progress, and we need new things, and we don't know, it's actually a really kind of surreal, perverse way of thinking, putting an engineer into a lab saying, do the worst job possible, but do it in a way that nobody notices, or do it in a way so the item looks really attractive so people buy it, and they will just look at the look of it and not worry about the function and the lifespan. And we seem to sort of think that's normal now.
That's true. And it's not like capitalism doesn't have some benefits, of course, but we can't ignore these systemic shortcomings and these unsustainable issues. I mean, they've got to be addressed. And as far as the history, I was also fascinated to learn that originally Bernard London, he proposed this idea of planned obsolescence as an actual law, that they were talking about the potential of having leases on products, that the product had to be turned in to be destroyed once it served its life, even if it still functioned. And of course, it never did become a law, but this is the kind of mindset we're dealing with and them trying to get this thing going. Of course, just refine it by making it a marketing thing, and then you can say, oh, well, it's people's choice. It's totally up to them to go get a new one. But of course, we're heavily manipulated, and the marketing is really fine-tuned, and it's kind of psychological warfare to a degree.
In a way, yeah. And then the interesting thing is also, Bernard London, he became famous for this idea, but even this sounds kind of totally purely 100% capitalist, he still had some social elements in it at the time, because he wrote his book about how to end the depression through planned obsolescence. So he really wanted people to work again. And I think he was faced with all these queues every day. He was living in New York and he was in real estate. He became from Eastern Europe somewhere, really poor. He'd come to the States and, made a fortune, but I think he was also sort of that generation of entrepreneur who wanted to give something back. So it seemed like a good idea. And also at the time, I think they were less worried about waste in a way. They hadn't seen these huge mountains of waste that we create now. And he did have a project that also meant, some of the things that were taken out of circulation by this law that he wants to make, they would be available for the second-hand market or for poorer people. So I think it's a very, very interesting sort of thought experiment. But the problem with planned obsolescence is also, it does work for factories and everything will keep moving, but it's not a long-term project because you always end up with more waste and you will end up using a lot more energy and natural resources than you actually have. If something lasts only a third of the time, then, like in the film, we shot a sequence that we unfortunately didn't have time for, but we talked to a designer who explained to us the difference between a cheap shirt and a quality shirt. And he talks about the different qualities of cotton and said, well, this shirt costs a third and it has a third of a lifespan, and the other one's good quality, lasts longer, so it's like financially almost the same thing, except that you have the fun or the burden, whatever, depends on whether you like shopping, that you have to keep replacing them. But a cheap shirt will create 3 times as much waste. On the other hand, I know jobs is an important consideration, but I'm not entirely convinced that this is the only way of keeping an economy going, because now we see, some repair businesses are coming back. We see also other products which are online, which don't actually have a physical object that, that breaks all the time. Things could also be designed maybe more in modules, so you can update one bit and that's where your market is. You have products like, you can buy people vouchers or invite them for dinner or a trip somewhere or a dance class. There's a lot of economic activity that could be created around activities rather than things that break and that are made of plastic or, cheap materials or whatever.
Right. Those are great points. And yeah, we should be fair and say these guys like Bernard London, at the time, they were dealing with the Great Depression, which was a serious hell on earth. That's obviously a terrible situation to be in. So they're very desperate for new ideas to get things moving and to keep them moving and to keep the cycle going. But it's kind of out of control at this point. But earlier you did mention printers as another example, and I love that one too. This is another area where it's very blatant to see what they've done. Tell us a little bit about some of the scams you've seen in the world of inkjet printers, consumer printers.
Okay. Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that, when you look at the light bulb, the planned obsolescence has to do with the thickness of the filament in the bulb. And then you gradually see planned obsolescence kind of moving a little bit also into our hairs and into fashion. And then there's another key moment when it moves into electronics. And that's in a way when the consumer really loses a lot of power, because you have something that's electronic with lots of little chips. And if you're not a specialist and you just don't know, you don't know which chip kind of burns through or whatever. And these things could be programmed. So I found a story about this inkjet printer that had a set number of pages. And I'm not going to tell you the brand, because I later then found out a lot of inkjet printers work according to the same principle. We found also user manuals and technicians manuals where they actually specify the number of pages, where it will say, well, this printer's programmed for either that many pages, either 5,000 pages or 3 years, whatever happens earlier, So that sounds quite deliberate to me. And then what you find is also, then people take this big thing maybe to a repair shop and they will say, new printer's much cheaper. And so that's one problem. And the other thing is, also I was interested actually the proof whether that's true or whether something had really worn out. So I took one of these printers, and the interesting thing is there's a little Russian freeware about that. They were saying, well, we can reprogram the chip, so the printer's not really broken. So I went to see a friend of mine who's a computer technician, and we installed the little freeware. And with that, we raised the number on this little counter, and we took it to the top level of pages that you were supposed to be printing, and the printer immediately stopped, and you get this little message on screen saying parts inside your printer have come to the end of its lifespan, or sometimes, it depends on the model, sometimes they don't tell you anything, and then of course any repair technician will say, well, I don't even know where the problem is, And then we took the Russian freeware and we kind of lowered the number of points again, and suddenly the printer worked again. We hadn't touched any other parts. And then we took it up again and it stopped printing, and we took it down again. I mean, you can do this all day long. So it's quite clear that the printer wasn't really broken. It was programmed to think that it was broken. And that was the difference. And then, of course, when you ask the manufacturers, they will say either, they say, well, we would never do that. People would just, go and buy a rival brand or something. But that's exactly the interesting thing. A lot of inkjet printers are kind of artificially cheap, and the idea is that you keep replacing them and that you buy a lot of expensive ink.
Right.
And then, the other justification is that they say, well, no, it's just, we're worried that something maybe is broken inside, or some of them have a little sponge inside, and they're saying, well, that fills up and then you will get ink stains, so it's much better to block it. But on the other hand, why don't they then say, check your sponge or something like that? And why don't they design the printer in a way that, have a little flap and you open it and then you can replace the sponge or something. And I met another technician. He had a lot of these printers in his company. He was basically in charge of, looking after all the printers in a big office. And he said he'd actually worked out that with the Russian freeware, you'd kind of, every time the printer blocked, you can go back down to 0 and the printer would start printing again. And you could do that about 6 times before the sponge actually really overflowed. So they were playing extremely safe and, far too safe. And I think, it's a lack of information. I think the consumer would have a right to know if they say there's a part that's come to the end of its life somewhere, they should say, is it the sponge, or should you check the mechanism or something? And because this lack of information means that you will take it somewhere when say it's really expensive and it's not worth it, and look at the amazing model that we have on offer this week, and there's another new piece of electronic waste being produced that maybe isn't really waste.
Right. Yeah, it is so ridiculous, and there are very few examples that are as blatant as putting a microchip in a printer that just says, okay, shut off at this point. I mean, it's really just engineered to fail. It's pretty ridiculous. And for companies to say, oh, well, there's so much competition, we couldn't really be doing this. I mean, that's just such an easy lie to see through, because when you factor in any product, usually there's only 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 companies that make it. And it's not very hard, like we saw in the light bulb example, for these companies to get together and create a standard. And if everybody follows the rules, then the consumer doesn't have a choice that actually works for them.
Yeah, and I think there should be at least a law that, would require them to put the lifespan on the label or something. And even if they don't want to run a whole system or whatever, at least we can then do the work ourselves and say, well, that costs that much and it's that many hours and that's twice as much or 3 times as much, because that's part of the equation, not just, the look and the fashion and the brand. And I think, the printer is quite a big debate, because a lot of people sort of then say, well, printers are so cheap, what are you worried about? And but I think it's just, it's the principle of not providing that information and getting away with it. And then the other thing I also found, for instance, in one of the manuals, it was instructing technicians, they're saying, well, if a customer does come in with a printer and he doesn't think it's too expensive, do change the sponge, but then don't put the counter back down to 0, put it halfway. And, even though the sponge is new, so in theory, the lifespan should now be the same. We should go back to the 5,000 pages or whatever. But I think they would, trying to make sure that you come back a little earlier, and maybe the second time around you say, well, I'm not going to do that again. This time I will upgrade, or, So I think it is quite well thought out. And it's part of the whole system. That's the other problem. I started making the film and I thought, well, maybe tell the light bulb story, and maybe there's the printer, and there's a few companies who decided to be, particularly greedy. But then doing more and more research, it turned out this whole planned obsolescence thing is actually in the whole system, and it's part of the whole system. And that, in a way, our growth economy depends on it. Not only on that, but it's one of the elements it's a really important part that keeps things moving. And it's actually really difficult to get out of it now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find a lot of the time people they rarely actually say, oh, you got it wrong on the documentary, that, that printer doesn't exist. It's usually more ideological objections saying, but we need it. And do you want everyone to be out of work?
Right.
So, And that usually creates a really, really interesting debate about, where are the future jobs and how we deal with waste and all that. So, people are very open, I think, generally.
Yeah, I mean, you don't obviously want to put people out of work, but it's like, what are we spending our life doing? Because there's a lot of people out there working for $20 an hour just to keep up with new light bulbs and getting a new printer and all the appliances in their life that are meant to break down. You're just trying to keep up with that and maintain your debt and just stay on the hamster wheel. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it, just how inefficient the whole process is and how much time, like you mentioned earlier, it wastes in going to buy these products, replace these products, but also just the time you spend shackled to a job that you're underpaid at just to kind of stay afloat.
Yeah, there is actually, I remember that there was an institute in Germany somewhere. They were stating in a report that we actually end up working more, because we need to replace things more often. So we need to earn more money. So we need to work more hours. And that was quite an interesting idea. Are we working extra hours because we need all these things? And do we need them? And do we need them as often as, as we think we need them? And I think, for instance, LED bulbs are an interesting example. I mean, I'm not saying they're like the only solution to the light bulb cartel dilemma or whatever, but it's a market where you can see that they cost a lot more, but they also last a lot longer. And a lot of people now have started making that calculation. They look at the lifespan and they also look at the fact that they use less electricity. And they're prepared to actually pay more money because they realize, well, it's probably about the same, and maybe it even saves me time. So it's not impossible to sell more expensive things that then last longer, maybe save you time and other things. It's something that could be explored, But on the other hand, especially with electronics, we see at the moment a sort of movement, people say we're in a big crisis. And so there's a lot of really cheap things flooding the market so everyone can have them. But the waste is just piling up because none of this lasts very long. And it probably can't last very long with other one who's going to make any money. It's true if you follow this. It's almost like a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a real parallel there, like you mentioned earlier with the clothing quality example, that more expensive quality clothing just costs more because they know you're not going to be buying it as often. So you're kind of buying like 4 shirts wrapped up into one that are going to last as long as those 4 cheap shirts might have lasted. It's just so ridiculous. But are there other good examples of planned obsolescence that maybe didn't make it into the movie that people might be interested in, that interested you?
Well, there is one actually that is in the movie, and which I really like, is about tights and stockings.
Oh yeah,
a lot of us women are interested in, because if you talk to women the age of your grandmother, whatever, they will tell you that this was a really important issue at the time, because you couldn't really just go out without tights or stockings. That was kind of seen as indecent, and if you wanted to be elegant, you had to wear them. But on the other hand, they would snag all the time and run ladders, and then this would then happen in the middle of a party. And then, girls, one lady told us that she got a ladder in the middle of a party, and then she said, I couldn't dance for the rest of the evening because people would have seen the ladder. And then, of course, he had, silk stockings were particularly nice, but they were also very fragile. It was a complete disaster. You maybe spend, part of your wages on that, and it was a constant problem. And then suddenly they invented nylon, and they tried nylon for stockings, and it went really well. And in the film, we're interviewing the daughter of one of the chemists who was involved at the time. And she said, well, she remembers when her father came home and he brought some sort of test stockings, because the idea was like, okay, well, they look fine, but, you take them home, everybody, and give them to your wives and girlfriends and see whether they like them. And at the time, they were quite thick, and they had a funny color. They were kind of green or something. They were just looking at the chemical structure at that moment. And the feedback was, well, these are great. They're going to last. I can stop worrying. I don't need to buy them all the time. And that's exactly when the sort of thinking kicked in again that we saw with the light bulb in the 20s, thinking, well, then all the women are going to buy one pair of nylon stockings. And that's the end of it, because then for the next 10 years, maybe they won't buy any. And that's the end of this new invention. And, they invested in it. So they sent the same engineers back into the lab saying, well, can you make them a bit more fragile? And then if you think about it, if you buy tights now, a lot of them, the cheaper ones don't even last a day. You get them for like one job interview or one particular occasion, and a lot of them, they don't survive. A lot of washes, they're really, really fragile, and that's another story I thought was really, really interesting.
Oh yeah, thanks DuPont. But it's so frustrating to realize something as simple as nylons or light bulbs, they're just nowhere near as efficient as they could be. It's something that just really irks me. I hate to see such inefficiency, but let me ask you, how do you think the world would be different if everything was designed to be the best it could be? What could we do about this cycle, or how to change it?
Well, also I think it depends on the definition of best, and I think it depends on the product. I think it makes perfect sense to have like your winter socks designed, whatever the best way they could be, because it's not something we enjoy buying for fun, so there's no reason to kind of buy them every 2 months if they could last for a year or something, just to come up with an example. In the same way, it doesn't make sense to build a computer that lasts for absolutely ever and ever and ever, because it's an industry that progresses. So it makes sense that a chair is sturdy and it lasts and it doesn't, collapse if you sit down on it. But it doesn't make quite as much sense if you're talking about technology that's evolving all the time. But in this case, I think the design that could be considered best and maybe wouldn't be one that's really long lasting. It could be one, which is more easily updated or repaired, or where you can, add new modules, like we've seen projects for mobile phones where you design yourself the combination of functions and you kind of get different modules that you combine. And then if one of them breaks, you can change just that one and not the whole thing. So, because nobody wants a computer for 20 years, so maybe there should be a way of, updating at least once. And then also maybe if it is something that's progressing a lot, maybe design it in a way so it's much more easy to actually recycle it, not use all these really, really toxic materials. So it doesn't make quite as much damage when it goes, into the recycling system. And that's, for instance, when ideas come into cradle to cradle or whatever. These are people are basically saying if you can take it apart really easily at the end and it's not toxic, then you can just put it back into the system. It's like if you have some metal somewhere, you melt it again and you put it into, a new version of the same product, and it goes round and round. And then it actually doesn't matter if you change it every month or whatever.
Right.
What is a problem is if it breaks and then you have huge mountains of toxic waste and you don't know what to do with all that. And in the meantime, there's more and more and more being produced all the time, like a laptop has hundreds of toxic ingredients, and each of these ingredients actually attacks a different part of the body when it gets into the air, when it gets into your lungs, or it gets into the water. And these things, they're not harmless. They might affect your lungs, they might affect your nervous system. Some of them are quite serious. A lot of the time there's no way of actually getting them out and separating them and isolating them. Once they've been produced, they're out. So in that case, that would be an argument really for using that computer for as long as possible, because once it's been produced and it is in a way, it has a dangerous afterlife, then it should be used for as long as you can. So at least it was sort of worth it in a way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Extend the life of the product so the benefits can at least start to try to compare the costs later. It is a great point about the poisonous components that make up our products. I've had some guests that take this all the way back to hemp and the threat to the textile industry. That would have been just another natural, effective, renewable alternative that people could have had and even made their own products from. But instead, everything was moved over to these complex plastics and oil-based stuff and chemicals, thanks to Rockefeller and Company. But yeah, with laptops and smartphones, I hear a lot about the concerns with the mining operations for these components, and also that they aren't great for people in certain parts of the process, especially, like you mentioned, after we throw them out. And of course, the digital waste of the modern age does get us into your second film, the e-waste tragedy, and it is a great extension of the planned obsolescence topic because it really is the fallout from this practice. And to get into that a little bit deeper, it is a pretty appropriate part 2 to the story, right?
Yes, in a way, when I was making the first part, I was sort of thinking, well, what is the problem with planned obsolescence? Because it does create jobs and the factories keep going. And so the idea was to find a story that would be an example for the sort of doubts we have and show that this isn't a long-term project really. It's something that maybe worked really well in the 20s and 30s and 50s or whatever. And that's when I heard about this dump site of electronic waste in Ghana. This is where a lot of computers end up. It looks like it's like a big field. It's basically a space that, it was a green next to a river, and people used to fish there, and then people started sort of dumping e-waste there, and you get young people sort of taking things apart and they burn them. It's really rudimentary, so their health really suffers. And the interesting thing is also you see the labels on these machines, because a lot of the time things get recycled and you still got these tags on them, so you know who they belong to. Or like big companies, when they have the same computer on every desk, a lot of the time they'll have a logo. So you can see these in Ghana. You can see, from the States specifically, especially, a lot of public institutions, a lot of hospitals, a lot of military computers, and they still all have their tags, so it's quite clear where they come from. So we found a little sequence showing this is where the waste goes. If something has a short lifespan, will become waste more quickly, and this is one of the places it goes to, and they don't really have the means to recycle it properly. And the interesting thing was that people really reacted a lot to that sequence. It was 3 minutes showing the dump size and how dangerous it is to people's health. And people were saying, well, how do they actually get there? Why do they need to go to Ghana? And this kind of got me onto the question, in Europe, for instance, we have a very detailed recycling system. So, the European Union has designed a system that if you buy a piece of electronics, the purchase price includes the cost of recycling. So, for instance, for, like a fridge, they will add 20 euros. So you pay the recycling in advance, and they use that money to set up a recycling system. And, they have recycling plants, they have collecting points where you can hand these things in. And the idea is that, the money is already there, and the know-how is also already there, and the technology also, to make sure all this is treated properly at the end. So there's really no reason for this to go to Africa or anything like that. But of course, the system doesn't really work because, this money is charged up front. So if a computer doesn't go to the official system, a corrupt recycler could take the computer or the fridge and say, I'm going to use that money that was paid in advance and I can recycle it properly. But then they don't do it. They will sell it to Africa or they will sell it to China. And that means they can actually get paid twice, once from the recycling system and once from the buyer. And the problem with that is really there's so much e-waste that it's impossible to control the quantities. And, you can very easily fill up a whole container with all this and send it to Africa and really make quite a lot of money. And that is very, very tempting, especially with shipping containers going back and forth, every minute of the day. So there's a lot of cheap space to be had to transport things. And so I was I was trying to work out really to answer that question, why does it go to Ghana if we have recycling plants? And the answer is it's very tempting for some people to divert that money.
Right.
And then, you have other countries in the US, the US doesn't even have like a whole, overall federal e-waste law. So it's not even illegal to export from the US. And that means it's really easy to fill up containers. And in the film, for instance, we talked to BAND, the Basel Action Network, who would like the international convention to be applied, the fact that you shouldn't export anything toxic, you should recycle in your own country. And, if you have the facilities, and they actually follow the waste from the US, and they find actually a lot of it goes to China and some of it goes to Africa. And it looks like it's really far away, but in long term, it means all these, materials, metals, whatever things you can recuperate, they are lost. And then also you get a lot of places which get contaminated, and that will come back to all of us in the end. I don't think we can send it far away enough that it will never impact on anyone. There's always going to be somebody getting sick.
Right. And it is really sad to see just the mountains of garbage, the old tube televisions, old 1995 computers and iPods, just these mountains of garbage. It's really hard for these third world nations to kind of get ahead when the whole rest of the developed world is using them as a garbage can. I loved the details in the documentary, just the fact that this whole infrastructure and these recycling centers, it is all set up, and people, the consumers, are paying for it in advance, but these companies just hire third-party recycling companies, and they don't ask questions. It's just like a out of sight, out of mind thing. And these third-party companies that are willing to dispose of stuff illegally and just dump it in another third world country, they can offer cheaper prices. So of course they're going to get the contract. So it's this big wink, wink, nod, nod thing, like where no one's really holding them accountable. But just like you say in the film at the beginning, the e-waste trafficking situation is bigger than the drug trade. I mean, that's obviously pretty big. Can you give us an idea of the true scope of the problem?
Well, obviously, it's difficult to count each piece because if you look at the customs declarations, they're never going, nobody puts illegal e-waste, They put plastics, they put recycled material, they will claim that the computers are still working. So you have to kind of work it the other way around. For instance, if you look at how many electronic gadgets have been sold, and then you look at how many of them make it to the recycling system, then you can see the rest has disappeared. And that gives you an idea. That is about 2/3 to 75% at the moment, which disappears, which doesn't arrive at the other end in an authorized facility. But of course, it doesn't mean that 75% of our dead fridges or whatever go to Ghana, because some of them, they end up with scrap dealers in Europe or in the US, they end up with companies who recycle in that particular country, but they're not doing it well. Because the money is basically in, you do it as cheaply as you can. For instance, you take a fridge and you just take off the metal at the back and you sell that, and you don't deal with the toxic bits, You're supposed to kind of use the money that you can make from selling the good bits to treat the other bits that are dangerous, really. And if you say that, you just put the money in your pocket, really.
Mm-hmm.
So some countries, I think they do export up to 10%. But I think a lot of the other things, some of them will be sitting in people's garages. We all have an old mobile phone somewhere or two. We probably have a TV somewhere in the guest room, So there's things which are kind of on their way to becoming e-waste, which is also quite worrying, thinking, well, they haven't even started traveling yet, and who knows where they're going to go.
Right. And
the other problem is it's in the system, really. Like, for instance, in the US, even the government sometimes ends up recycling badly, not necessarily maybe because that's the intention, of the civil servant dealing with it, but the taxpayer is not supposed to be burdened. So if someone rings up saying, I'm a recycler and I have a really good offer this week, I think a lot of institutions are obliged to take the best offer. But on the other hand, it's actually really suspicious. If someone says I recycle for free, or I will actually give you money for your old computers, and they're not going to, you can be fairly sure they're not going to do it properly. They're probably going to export it because there's no way they can do a proper job. Recycling safely costs money.
Exactly.
So if you have an old computer, you probably should pay for that, and you have when you bought it in Europe at least. So if someone says I give you money for your old computer, that you should probably check them out and turn down their offer until you check them out.
Right. And some numbers I grabbed from the movie that were pretty shocking in terms of the U.S. waste is that about 9.5 million tons a year comes from the U.S. to the rest of the world. And then 20 to 50 shipping containers leave the U.S. every day. I mean, that is a lot of garbage. But, of course, we talked about the fact that even if there are international laws, they just circumvent them. But there is an agreement that most of the nations of the world have signed, with the exception of the U.S., right?
Yeah, let me elaborate on that. I mean, there's a convention called the Basel Convention, and that basically says that you shouldn't export any toxic waste if you have a facility in your own country. If you don't, let's say you have some really dangerous nuclear waste and the country next to you has the best plant, then yes, you can export it, but you need to do all the paperwork and it should really go there, But it doesn't mean, for instance, that the US shouldn't export e-waste because they are recycling facilities, and they certainly shouldn't go to Ghana where there aren't any. So that's the sort of thing that the Basel Convention is prohibiting. And, the US is the only industrialized country that hasn't ratified it. So, they did sign it, but it was never made into federal law. So at the moment you have a sort of patchwork situation, like each US state probably recycles some things, but it's organized in different ways. And in some states it's really difficult to recycle printers because, no one's going to pay for an old printer. And other places, computers are well organized, but maybe with fridges you have to drive really fast. And So there's not really a unified system. And then what happens is you get also people sort of organizing charity events, so saying, bring your old computers and, we'll sell them and recycle them and give money to charity. But people then are really happy to come with all their old, gadgets, and, people turn up with whole carloads full of things that they have in their garage. And then if that particular state, if they're slightly more strict about it, when you just go to a harbour somewhere else and ship it from there. And the problem is the quantities. You can't open every single container, because apart from these containers, you also have, lots of legitimate containers, and there's billions of containers traveling every day, and it's physically impossible to open them all, But from the US, there is a lot of material leaving, and, BAN, they did this sort of tracking project, and they found even, recyclers with a good reputation, they were exporting through the back door. And and then the thing that shocks me is always there's a lot of computers that come from government institutions. So when we were filming in Hong Kong and the new territories, we actually found even a laptop from the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency. So and I presume they'd done the same thing. They'd got some offers in and they took the best offer, and that particular company had a contact in Hong Kong, and then that's where it ended up. So I think it's it's important, the whole thing that the taxpayer shouldn't be burdened, but in this particular case, it's not a good thing for recycling. It makes it really difficult to do it properly. And the other thing is, that's a story that I didn't unfortunately have space for in the film, but there's a whole issue also around military equipment. That's supposed to be recycled in the US because these are sensitive technology. It's security is at stake. It was also very expensive. So you get situations where the military needs to recycle some highly sensitive equipment. And, in one case, they went to a recycler and they had to, they did signed a contract that it was supposed to be recycled there and absolutely nowhere else. And then suddenly, the chips from that equipment started turning up in China, and people started saying, the Chinese don't know how to copy anything, isn't that amazing, And then it's like, well, no, these chips got to China because that particular US recycler actually took the money from the military and then they shipped it and, they sold it to China anyway. So again, someone got paid twice for the work. And it was, it was really risky because now there's some sort of, really elaborate military chips on the free market, so to speak. And you have all these websites where you can buy sort of any chip you like, and like, for instance, during my research for the film, I was talking to an expert on, how do you know if a chip is safe or even, if it's working properly. And we went on one of these many, many websites where you can buy chips, and we put out a request for a chip that doesn't actually exist. And we immediately got offers. It was really amazing. The mailbox filled up and people saying, how many do you want and when do you want them? And basically what's happening there is, when e-waste goes abroad, all the chips get taken out and then they clean them up and they polish them up, and, they might end up in the rain, they might end up in the sun in high temperatures. You don't know whether they're working. And there's a lot of faking going on also. If I order a chip that is more expensive and than what they actually just recycled from a whole truckload of computers, well, they just change the label on it and sell me that chip as the one I wanted. And this is, maybe if you have a mobile phone that kind of has some mysterious error and it keeps switching off or something, that's not dangerous. But if a chip like that ends up in, public transport or something, then that is dangerous. So, yeah. So, recycling has to be done responsibly. And if you have a world where it's all about, money, 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 then that responsibly goes out the window. So we talked to some investigators who said they'd actually had a tram catching fire, because one of the chips kind of burnt out because it wasn't actually made for that sort of temperature, but they'd kind of put a new label on it that was saying, yes, you can, doesn't matter if this gets hot, and this chip is much more expensive, that's why they put that label on it.
Man. Wow. Well, Cosima, again, a great 1-2 punch with these two films, an in-depth look at some serious problems that need addressing and should make us think about how we can make our system better and more sustainable. So thanks for that, and thanks for being here. Can you tell the people where they can watch these films online, or any other links or information you might want to give them?
Well, the Lightbulb Conspiracy, you can get at the video project if you go online, and you might find it at your library, or you go and find our Facebook page, which is facebook.com, the Lightbulb Conspiracy, altogether, no dots, whatever. And, if you send me a message, then, I'm the one who's reading the message on that page. You've got the same as the E-Waste film, facebook.com, E-Waste Tragedy. And, you can send me a message. I'm also still doing screenings at festivals, sometimes at universities. That's the best place to find them.
Right on. Well, thanks again so much, and keep fighting the good fight out there.
Thank you very much.
You got it. All right, boys and girls, Cosima Dannoritzer, big thanks to her. This was sort of a self-serving episode because I've been a big fan of the Lightbulb Conspiracy for a couple of years, so I tracked her down and she agreed to come on. And these might not be very epic issues in the grand scheme of things, but they are issues. Just extrapolate out from something as simple as a light bulb. I think we all know the rot runs really deep. And of course, the e-waste. Definitely check out her documentaries if you're interested in going deeper into these things. I also like the section where we talked about the whole communist Eastern Bloc thing going on, and we discussed the German practices of making things to last and maximizing efficiency. We've talked about a similar thing before with socialized medicine, that when you remove that profit motive, they don't want you to keep coming back like a car mechanic. They actually want to heal you, send you home, and get on with their day because they're not getting paid by volume or from shady pharmaceutical companies that are just breaking them off commissions for selling them drugs that they really don't know what's in them. They only know what the pharmaceutical reps tell them, and that might be a biased opinion. But anyway, it's just interesting. I'm not saying I'm a communist and that I want the system to assign us all factory jobs just so we could have better light bulbs, but it's just an idea worth talking about and looking at some of the ways it might have been more efficient. We don't have to be scared of ideas or overly paranoid about, hey, wait a minute, that sounds like X or Y, and those are bad. They're just systems. Just other ways things have been done that we might have forgotten about or haven't heard talked about in a fair and rational, non-propaganda-driven way. So, I hope you liked it. But in other news, if you want to see more Greg Carlwood, I did do 2 extra things last week that you can check out online. First, you guys know I love the comedy world, and a pretty prominent comic, Sam Tripoli, started a podcast called Tinfoil Hat. And I was lucky enough to be a guest recently. It's in video, which some people keep asking me to do things on video. So check this out. And I'd appreciate it if you did, because I talked to Sam about maybe doing some conspiracy comedy crossover stuff. So if you check it out, let him know if you liked it. And maybe I can elbow my way into working with some comics as the resident conspiracy guy. I would love to do that on the side. You'd get more content, I'd get friends, and opportunities to leave the house. So go to YouTube and just look for Tinfoil Hat Greg Carlwood. Also, another strange release for me, but there is a YouTube show called Hot Ones that I really like, where Sean Evans sits down with celebrities and asks them 10 questions over the course of eating 10 hot wings of increasing hotness. Well, I wanted to try it, but I know I'm not on the level of being on the real show, so I just bought the hot sauces and had my hot sauce connoisseur friend Anthony host a Q&A with me as we ate the wings. We were drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke, and just hanging out with a bunch of people, but if you have any interest in watching me throw up in my mouth and cry a little bit, it's a fun watch. Definitely check out the real show too, because it is so much better. I just had some people over for a poker game, so before that, we knocked out the Hot Wing Challenge, and it was pretty great to have a live studio audience complete with a natural laugh track. So big thanks to everyone who was there for that, but you can watch it on the Higherside Chats YouTube channel, and it's kind of fun. So just 2 random other things I did if you want to put a face to the voice or are looking to fill some time between THC episodes and you've already seen the whole 7 seasons of Dance Moms. But that's this episode. I hope you liked it. My fiance listened to it and she took some of these issues to heart. She had a folding makeup bag thing and it ripped. And instead of throwing it away, she got out a needle and thread and she stitched that bitch up because our throwaway culture was on the forefront of her mind. So we're making a difference, 1 makeup bag at a time. You know, it is interesting because if we all fixed one thing instead of throwing it away this week, that would be tens of thousands of items. And that's kind of cool. We might not be fixing computers, but less waste is a good thing overall, and dumping our trash in the third world, that ain't right. And it isn't a left or right issue. It's just a shitty thing that our culture does. And maybe we can be a little less shitty and a little more conscious of it and contribute to it a little less. As always, we give you a commercial-free hour just because I'm such a great man. And we have a second hour if you'd like to go deeper into all the great episodes we do for that $5 monthly subscription. In the second hour of this episode, we get into Seattle's toxic ash dumping scandal, the pros and cons of class action lawsuits, the extent of the health problems that e-waste causes. We talk about the move away from independence granting skills in school and culture, laws and regulation differences around the world that are quite telling of the systems they're instituted in. The expected resource crisis of 2030. That's coming down the pike. And, of course, leading ideas for a more sustainable system. All good stuff. Sign up if you want to double your THC fun and support the ongoing journey into the untalked about. That said, I'm getting out of here. I've done my part. Your move, light bulb nerfers and printer breakdown planners. Your fucking move.
Well, they tie that yellow ribbon round the oak tree. They've worn out all the prayer in their hearts. All along thought they were rooting for the home team as they're sent to the game and torn apart. We twist this tourniquet upon the pipeline that he carries all the pain in the world as we blindly clap and cheer from the sidelines. It's clear on a losing streak from the very start, and that's where they found me, in the cemetery, a smoking gun in my hand. Now I'm down for the land of the free. THC, the American scream. They took that faded ribbon off the oak tree. They've worn out all the hope in their hearts. All along thought I was doing the right thing. Now I'm lying in a pool of my blood, and that's where they found me, in the cemetery, a smoking gun in my hand. Now I'm down from the land of the free. Sing with me, and that's where they found me, in the cemetery, a smoking gun in my hand. Now I'm down from the land of the free. THC, the American scream. The American scream. And that's where they found me, in the cemetery, a smoking gun in my hand. Now I'm down from the land of the free. Sing with me, the American scream.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the first hour of the Higherside Chats podcast with me, Greg Carlwood. If you don't know, there is a second hour to all the episodes we do around here. Generally, we're able to get a lot deeper into the topics and ideas that a guest is about, so if you enjoyed what you've heard from THC for free, consider signing up at the HighersideChatsPlus.com to get the second hour of the 5 shows I put together each month. I never really wanted to be a paid subscriber podcast, but I really hate the idea of spending airtime promoting some product that's completely unrelated and telling you the best way to support the show is to buy an audiobook or new underwear by mail or something crazy like that. So instead, if you like the show, double your time with it for $5 a month and let's cut out all the other shit. It's half the price of a movie ticket and you get at least an extra 5 hours of show a month. Collectively, it keeps us stable and it frees me from wasting your time with anything but the show you came to listen to. It's really the only way for an independent one-man show to make it, and I do what I can so that it's worth your while. Since we started this, I've always tried to use the subscriptions to improve the podcast and make signups more advantageous. It started with just a second hour for the main show, but now we've got a nice forum going where people can get deeper in conversation about the episodes with other listeners, submit a candidate in the guest request thread, or share their own personal projects to get out of the soul-crushing 9-to-5 cog-in-the-wheel life on the Entrepreneurs thread. The forum and the plus comments are always the first places I try to go for listener engagement, but it does get harder as the show gets more popular. Because of that, there's also a direct messaging feature that you can use to reach me through the plus site also. But beyond the forum, if you like any of the music I've used for THC, most of it I've hired artists to make, and I provide it all as free downloads to Plus members too. So if you like a particular song you've heard close the show out recently, come get the MP3. I should also mention that if you don't like the idea of paying $5 recurring every month, I get that. You can buy 3 months, 6 months, or a year up front and just be done with it. I have plenty of listeners who send checks and money orders to the P.O. Box too. I try to make it as easy for people as I can, and you can read more about it on the sign-up page. Also, be sure to check out the FAQ help page on the Plus site if you have any questions or concerns about how to listen to a password-protected show on your devices. I've highlighted a lot of great solutions, and one of those would be the iPhone app that just recently hit the Apple App Store. A super kind and talented listener made it for us, and you can use it to stream or download either the free or the Plus show. If you're on Android, I'd use Pocket Casts or Podcast Addict and subscribe to the feed manually that way. I also try to throw in occasional bonus shows or Q&A shows, and I've got a few other weird ideas I might get to try out soon, but I give you all I can for $5, and I hope you'll at least give it a shot if you've listened to a few free shows and you find them unique or valuable. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there, and I'm just one of them. But if you have any questions, concerns, or comments about any of this, please get in touch with us at the Higherside Chats team at gmail.com. I also wanted to plug the Higherside newsletter I'm going to be putting out, totally free for anyone who wants to sign up at the main internet website for the show, thehighersidechats.com. You can also get on that email list through the Higherside Chats Facebook page. There's a button there as well. But the reason I'm doing this is because I get tons and tons of emails after a show goes up asking me about how I feel about a particular guest or topic, and the wrap-up isn't always the best place to do that, especially if I have anything negative to say. Sometimes the dust needs to settle. Sometimes I need to hear feedback from you guys first. There are a lot of factors, but I usually have something to communicate to you, and I just don't get to do it. So on the first of the month, I plan to send out a little newsletter with my thoughts about the 5 shows the previous month, and talk to you about anything else that's on my mind or that's going on. And what's probably most enticing is that I'm going to give you some insight into at least one guest I have coming up in the month, which people have been begging for some posted schedule for a long time. I personally think I'd like the surprise. But sign up for the Higherside newsletter. It's free. It comes out on the first of the month, and I won't waste your time with any other emails. And that's it. I appreciate you listening. I try to give alternative ideas and guests a fair shake on a high-quality podcast, expose some deep-level conspiracies without the yelling, and I hope to offer some inspiration that even though the system relentlessly suggests you should follow their blueprint to mediocrity, you can do your own thing and live a much happier life despite all the negativity in the world. So go ahead and treat yourself. Isn't it about time?